"This land will be mine soon enough, Mr. Hayes. The old lady doesn't understand business, or what she's even walking on anymore," my own flesh and blood declared, as I stood just 6 feet behind her, holding the heavy serving tray. "My name is Eleanor, and I'm 74 years old. I've spent my entire life cultivating roots so that others might flourish. They see a slow-handed widow, but they completely ignore the digital locks I've learned to secure. The air that Tuesday afternoon carried that dense, sticky weight that always precedes summer thunderstorms in our valley. It was a heat that clung to your skin, making the cicadas sing with deafening urgency among the high branches of the eucalyptus trees. From the kitchen window, I had been watching the dirt road for over an hour, the one that connected the main entrance of the ranch to the paved highway. Golden dust still hung in the air, stirred up by the neighbor's tractors hours earlier. The house, an old structure with thick walls and high wooden ceilings, maintained a deceptive coolness inside. It was the refuge that my husband Arthur and I had built stone by stone, weight by weight. Arthur had passed away 5 years ago, after 40 years of working this land. His heart, weary from battling frosts, droughts, and the whims of the weather, simply stopped one winter night as he slept beside me. Since then, silence had become my only constant companion, a silence that wasn't empty, but filled with memories. The echo of his footsteps in the hallway, the brush of his leather boots against the ceramic floor of the entryway. I had learned to live with that gentle ghost, keeping the ranch afloat, making sure the walnut trees got their annual pruning, the fences were painted before the rainy season, and the numbers, those numbers that used to give Arthur such a headache, balanced perfectly at the end of each month. And then there was Claire, my only daughter, the child for whom we had sacrificed our own youth, for whom we had sold our first almond harvest at a discount to pay for her private school in the city, for whom I had worn the same raw wool coat for 12 winters straight, so she would never lack a new dress for end-of-year parties. Claire had left for the city at 18, and little by little, the asphalt had erased the smell of damp earth from her memory. Her visits had become rare, measured in hours, always accompanied by a nervous rush, furtive glances at her cell phone screen, and excuses about urgent meetings and clients who couldn't wait. The day before, a phone call had caught me as I prepared dough for bread. "Mom, I'll be there this afternoon," she had said, her voice unusually high, vibrant, charged with an energy I couldn't quite identify. "I'm bringing a friend, an acquaintance from the city who needs to get away from the noise, breathe some fresh air, make something nice, but nothing too heavy. He's a man of refined tastes." I had smiled, wiping flour from my hands onto my apron. A mother always hopes, always harbors the belief that her child's return will be genuine. So, I spent the entire morning in the kitchen. I beat eggs with sugar until the mixture formed a perfect ribbon. I grated the zest from the brightest lemons in our backyard orchard. I lit the big oven and prepared that moist pound cake she loved so much when she was a little girl with scraped knees from climbing trees. From the dining room hutch, I took out the bottle green porcelain teacups with the gilded rim. They were my most cherished treasure as far as dishware went. Arthur and I had bought them on a trip to the city to celebrate our 10th wedding anniversary. They were delicate, fine, almost translucent if you held them up to the light. For years, they'd only seen the light on Christmases or baptisms. I washed them carefully under the faucet, drying them with a clean cotton cloth, feeling the fragility of the ceramic beneath my arthritic fingers. My knuckles weren't what they used to be. They were swollen, marked by decades of plunging my hands into cold soil to pull out weeds by the root. But my pulse remained steady. When I heard the crunch of thick tires on the gravel of the driveway, my heart gave a small leap of anticipation. I peered from behind the lace curtain in the kitchen. It was an enormous vehicle, black, gleaming, a block of metal and dark glass that looked utterly out of place among the hydrangeas and rose bushes flanking the porch. The driver's door opened first, and a man descended. He wasn't the typical friend seeking fresh air. He wore an impeccably cut grey suit, no tie, but with a shirt so stark white it hurt the eyes under the 3 p.m. sun. A wide-screen smartwatch gleamed on his left wrist. He walked with measured steps, assessing the terrain not like someone admiring nature, but like someone calculating square footage. Then Claire got out. She wore white linen pants and high heels that immediately began to sink into the loose soil of the path. I saw her curse under her breath, shaking her foot with a gesture of profound distaste. That was the first sharp prick in my chest, the disdain on her face as she looked at the land that had fed her, the land that had paid for her luxuries and her education. She approached the man, touched his arm with an affected familiarity, and pointed towards the old wooden shed where we kept the large tools and the tractor. They spoke in low voices, nodding. I couldn't hear what they were saying from the window, but the language of their bodies was clear. They were appraising my life. They decided not to enter the house. Instead, they immediately settled into the wicker chairs on the outdoor porch, the very same chairs where Arthur and I used to sit and sip iced tea, watching the sun set behind the distant hills. I prepared the coffee. I didn't use the electric machine, but the old French press. The aroma of freshly ground coffee filled the kitchen, mingling with the citrusy sweetness of the pound cake already resting on a crystal plate. I cut the slices carefully. I placed everything on the heavy silver tray, the one with the carved handles, the green cups, the shining spoons, the small pitcher of warm milk, the sugar cubes. Everything perfect, everything as expected from an elderly mother receiving guests. I walked slowly down the central hallway of the house. The Apache wooden floorboards creaked softly under my cloth slippers. I know every sound in this house. I know which board to step on to make no noise, and which to avoid if I don't want to wake anyone. On the walls, framed photographs watched me as I passed. Arthur with his straw hat, smiling at the camera. Claire, at 5 years old, holding a newborn lamb. Myself, much younger, with black hair pulled back in a braid, leaning against the wire fence, an entire life hanging in wooden frames. As I neared the double doors leading to the porch, I paused. The doors were ajar, letting the breeze pass through. I was in the shadow of the hallway, hidden from their eyes. I lifted my foot to take the last step and announce my presence, but the man's voice, clear and deep, froze me in place. "It's a magnificent stretch of land, Claire. The topographic surveys you sent don't do it justice," said the man I would later know as Mr. Hayes. I heard the click of a lighter, followed by the acrid smell of cigar smoke. "The land has the perfect slope for cabins on the west side, but the property title is the main issue. Are you absolutely sure your mother is willing to cede total control? This eco-resort project requires a complete transfer of ownership. My investors in the city won't put a single dime in if they have to deal with life estates, shared signatures, or the whims of an elderly woman. We need the land clean, legally and physically." The weight of the tray in my hands seemed to multiply by 10. The silver rim dug into my palms. I stopped breathing. I waited for my daughter's response. I waited for the woman I had raised, the child I had taught to walk on that very porch, to defend our home. I waited for her to say that this house was not for sale, that her mother was not a burden, that the walnut trees her father had planted with his own hands would not be uprooted to build luxury cabins for strangers. But what I heard was a laugh, a short, dry laugh, devoid of any warmth. "Don't worry about it, Hayes," Claire said, and her voice sounded so cold, so calculating, that for an instant I doubted it was her. "My lawyer is already drawing up the paperwork. She'll sign the general power of attorney next week. I'll tell her it's mandatory county paperwork to update agricultural taxes and avoid fines. She's terrified of government debts. This land will be mine very soon, Mr. Hayes. The old lady doesn't understand business, or what she's even walking on. She lives in the past, watering her plants and polishing furniture. With a couple of legal papers drafted in confusing terms, she'll transfer everything to me without reading the fine print. She won't ask a single question. She trusts me blindly." The world stopped. The cicada's song seemed to fade, swallowed by a dense hum that rose from the back of my neck to my ears. The old lady doesn't understand business. The old lady doesn't know what she's walking on. My hands began to tremble. The tiny clinking of the spoons against the green porcelain saucers threatened to betray me. I clenched my teeth so hard I felt the pain in my jaw. I closed my eyes. In the darkness of my eyelids, I saw the image of Claire crying with fever at 10 years old, and myself placing cold compresses on her forehead for 3 consecutive nights. I saw Arthur selling his favorite horse to pay for her law school tuition. I saw all the renunciations, all the silences, all the plates of food I went without, so that she would have plenty. And there she was, sitting in her deceased father's chair, offering my life as a sacrifice to please a man in a gleaming suit. She was robbing me, not with a weapon, but with my own love, using my trust as a knife. The pain was an immense wave, a physical blow that left me breathless. I felt my knees weaken, felt that sadness would drag me to the wooden floor, that I would fall apart right there in a puddle of useless tears. But then, as the pain descended to my stomach, something else began to rise from deep within me. A cold spark, a hardened metal. The sentimental woman, the mother willing to give her life, stepped aside, closing the door behind her. In her place stood someone different, a sentinel. I adjusted my grip on the tray. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the stranger's tobacco smell and the dust of my own land. They believed I was a relic, an old piece of furniture, good only for making jams and baking cakes. They believed the modern world of contracts and finance passed me by because I wore long skirts and kept my hair in a grey bun. Claire had forgotten who really handled the ranch's accounts when her father was alive. She had forgotten who spent sleepless nights cross-referencing data, checking international quotes, managing the transition from paper ledgers to encrypted spreadsheets. I pushed the double door open with my shoulder and stepped out onto the porch. The sunlight struck my face. Claire was leaning forward, a complicit smile directed at the investor, but upon hearing my steps, her posture instantly changed. She straightened up with a jerk. The predatory smile vanished, replaced by the mask of the loving, devoted daughter. "Oh, Mom!" she exclaimed, her voice syrupy sweet, making my stomach churn. "I was just telling Mr. Hayes how beautiful your garden is. What smells so good? You made the lemon pound cake." I approached the small wrought iron table between them. I didn't say a single word. My face was a stone mask. Mr. Hayes extinguished his cigar in the clay ashtray and gave me a look that was meant to be kind but only succeeded in being condescending. "Mrs. Eleanor, a pleasure to meet you," he said, extending a hand. "Your daughter has told me wonders about this place. It's an absolute haven of peace." I did not take his hand. Both my hands were occupied holding the silver tray. I looked into his eyes, dark and calculating, and then I looked at my daughter. I maintained my silence. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Silence has its own weight, a gravity that unnerves those accustomed to filling the air with lies. Claire swallowed, shifting restlessly in the wicker chair. "Mom, let me help you," she said, extending her hands towards the tray. I moved a millimeter, just enough to reject her help without making a sharp movement. I leaned down and, with absolute precision, began to serve. First, I took a green cup and placed it in front of Mr. Hayes, then the small plate. Then I poured the black coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the warm afternoon. Then I turned to Claire, placed her cup, poured her coffee, put the plate with the slices of lemon pound cake in the center of the table, and arranged the small milk pitcher. I didn't utter a single sound. There was no usual, "How are you?" or "Did you have a good trip?" There were no polite smiles or tender glances. The contrast between the sweetness of what I was serving and the coldness of my movements was absolute. "Mom, are you okay?" Claire asked, and for the first time all afternoon, I heard a hint of genuine doubt in her voice. The silence was suffocating her. I finished arranging the last spoon. I straightened up. I stared at her intently. I didn't see my daughter. I saw an intruder. I saw someone who was willing to dig up her father, to sell his plot of land. I held her gaze until she lowered her eyes, unable to bear the weight of my scrutiny. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to make a scene in front of the stranger, nor cry, nor accuse her of what I had just overheard. Scandal is the resort of those who have no power. I, on the other hand, knew exactly what I had to do. I picked up the silver tray, now empty of cups and plates, and turned away. "Mom," Claire called after me, her voice slightly strained. "Aren't you going to sit and have coffee with us?" I didn't turn around. I didn't quicken my pace. I walked back into the house, letting the double doors close slowly behind me. The contrast between the blinding light of the porch and the cool gloom of the hallway enveloped me. I walked back along the same Apache wooden path. I bypassed the kitchen. I bypassed Arthur's portrait on the wall. My steps were rhythmic, determined. The pain had been encapsulated, stored in a deep drawer in my chest that I would not open again until the work was done. I reached the end of the hallway where my room was located. It was a spacious, austere room, dominated by the large matrimonial bed that now felt too big for me. In a corner by the window that overlooked the lemon orchard was my old oak desk. On it rested my laptop, closed, silent, plugged in. I entered the room, placed the silver tray on the dresser next to the mirror. The metal made a dull sound as it hit the wood. I stood in the center of the room for an instant, listening to the muffled murmurs coming from the outdoor porch. Claire was surely telling Mr. Hayes that I was tired, that age made me grumpy, that he shouldn't pay attention to my silence. She would be weaving her webs, confident of her victory, convinced that her poor old mother was in the room praying a rosary or taking a nap. I walked towards the oak desk. I sat in the chair, feeling the firm back against my spine. I extended my hands, those widow's hands. They mocked so much, those hands supposedly only good for watering plants, and I lifted the lid of the laptop. The screen came to life, illuminating my face with a cold, blue glow in the dimness of the room. I looked towards the solid wooden door of my room. With a calm movement, I stood up. I walked towards it, took the brass doorknob, and pushed. The metal bolt clicked into the frame with a dry, firm, definitive snap, separating me from the rest of the house and the entire world. Click. And I was alone in front of the screen. The blue glow of the screen illuminated the wrinkles on my hands, those same hands that my own daughter had just declared useless for the world of business. The silence in my room was absolute, barely interrupted by the almost imperceptible hum of the laptop's internal fan. Outside, the afternoon heat continued to press down on the valley, and through the closed window, I could hear the distant echo of Mr. Hayes' voice, surely still calculating how many meters of my life he could pave. I stared at the Windows desktop for a few seconds. The background image was a photograph of the walnut trees in autumn, a sea of golden leaves that Arthur and I had planted during our first decade of marriage. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs slowly, forcing my heart to return to a normal rhythm. The sharp pain that had pierced my chest on the porch was transforming. It was no longer an open wound bleeding sadness. Now it was a solid block of ice, cold, heavy, and perfectly clear. The mother who excused her daughter's absences, the one who baked cakes hoping to buy a little affection, had stayed out there by the green porcelain cups. The woman sitting in front of this screen was the sentinel of everything we had built. I moved the mouse with firmness. I double-clicked the hidden folder in the bottom right corner. The screen asked for a password. Claire always laughed at me when I tried to use her smartphone, mocking my slowness in typing text messages. She believed my understanding of technology was limited to turning on the TV and answering calls. She completely ignored that during the last 10 years of her father's life, when the numbers began to dance in Arthur's head from stress and fatigue, I had sat up entire nights studying. I had taken virtual courses in agricultural accounting, learned to manage complex spreadsheets, and digitized every receipt, every invoice, and every title to our property. Arthur hated banks and modern paperwork. I became his shield. I typed the password. It wasn't a birthday date or a pet's name. It was a 1-6 character alphanumeric sequence that changed every 6 months. The folder opened, revealing the financial heart of San Julio Ranch. I didn't waste time looking at our savings. I went directly to the internet browser and opened the official county property registry portal. I had my own username and password, credentials that the government required of large regional producers to streamline tax procedures. The page took a few seconds to load, the circular icon spinning in the center of the screen while my pulse remained serene. When the control panel appeared, I went to the parcel status query section. I entered our ranch's cadastral nomenclature number. The system blinked and displayed the recent history. My eyes scanned the lines of dark gray text on the white background, and there it was, the digital trace of the betrayal. Exactly 4 days ago, a law firm from the city had requested an urgent title report on my property. The applicant's name was an associate lawyer from the firm where Claire worked as an external consultant. But that wasn't the worst part. In the Pending Procedures tab, a municipal file number initiated that very morning was listed. The title of the procedure was as clear as our creek water. Request for endorsement for transfer of domain by revocable special power of attorney, an irrevocable power. Claire not only wanted me to sign authorization to administer, she wanted a document that would strip me of all control, a power that could not be revoked even if I changed my mind. The next day, she wanted total authority to sell, subdivide, and liquidate her father's land to Mr. Hayes, leaving me, hopefully, a miserable pension and a rented room in some grey city where I wouldn't bother anyone. The old lady doesn't know what she's walking on, she had said. I closed my eyes for an instant, feeling the sting of disappointment burning my pupils. We had paid for her law degree by selling our best tractor. We had eaten lentil stew without meat for months, so she could buy her law books, and now she was using that same knowledge, that same legal machinery we funded with sweat to dispossess us. I opened my eyes. The sadness was over. It was time to work. I picked up my cell phone, a robust black case device resting next to the computer. I found the number in my contacts and pressed call. I held the receiver to my ear, listening to the dial tone. 1, 2. On the third ring, a deep, slow, formal voice answered on the other end. Arkwright and Associates. Good afternoon. Dr. Walter Arkwright speaking. Walter, I said. My voice sounded firmer and deeper than I expected. It's Eleanor. I need to speak with you now. There was a brief pause on the other end. Walter Arkwright wasn't just the main notary in the neighboring town. He had been a family friend for over 30 years. He had known Arthur since they were young men and had been the legal architect of all our important moves. He was an old-school man, one of those who still wore a full suit in the middle of July and believed a handshake was worth more than any printed contract. Eleanor, my dear, so good to hear from you, Walter said, though his professional tone immediately softened, taking on a note of genuine concern. Is everything all right at the ranch? I was just thinking of you this morning. No, Walter, it's not all right. I need to ask you a direct question, and I want the unvarnished truth. Did someone from a city law firm contact you this week, asking for copies of the ranch's original deeds? The silence that followed was dense, charged with uncomfortable surprise. I could hear the sound of a leather chair creaking, as if Walter had suddenly straightened up at his desk. Yes, he finally replied, his voice dropping an octave. Yesterday afternoon, a young, very arrogant lawyer told me he represented Claire and that they needed certified copies of the original titles to initiate a cadastral update procedure. It seemed extremely strange to me that you didn't call me first, Eleanor. I told that young man that without your express, in-person authorization, I wouldn't move a single paper from my safe. I was planning to call you tonight to ask you what all this was about. You did well not to give him anything, Walter. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Eleanor, what's going on? The notary asked, the alarm already evident in his voice. That lawyer mentioned something about your health. He implied you were having, and I quote his words, memory difficulties, and that Claire was taking legal responsibility for your own good to spare you the stress of numbers. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. It was a dry, joyless sound that bounced off the walls of my room. So that was the story my daughter was fabricating. I wasn't just an ignorant old woman. Now I was also a senile woman who needed to be rescued from her own incapacity. My memory is perfect, Walter, so perfect that I remember exactly what Arthur and I signed in your office in the winter of 2012. Claire brought an investor to the ranch today, a man in a suit who wants to build an eco-resort and raise the Walnut Grove. I overheard her talking to him on the porch. She has an irrevocable general power of attorney prepared. She's going to present it to me next week, disguised as municipal paperwork. She wants me to sign over total rights to the land. I heard Walter curse under his breath. One of the few times in 3 decades I had heard him use foul language. It's an outrage, an absolute dirty trick, the notary muttered, indignation vibrating through the receiver. Eleanor, don't sign anything, absolutely anything. If she presents you with a paper, tell her you want to read it with me first. With that power, she can sell the land for pennies and legally leave you on the street. If you put your signature there, your margin for defense afterward is almost nil. Don't worry, Walter. I won't sign her power of attorney, I said, looking at my computer screen, but I also won't wait for her to corner me. I want us to activate the dormant clause of the Agricultural Corporation. Today. The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. Walter was processing the magnitude of my request. What Claire didn't know, what no one in the city knew, was that San Julio Ranch was not in my personal name. Years ago, when Arthur began to feel unwell and seeing our daughter become increasingly distant, obsessed with quick money and city life, Walter suggested a protection strategy. We transferred the ownership of all our land to a closed private corporation that we ourselves created. I own 99% of the shares, but in that corporation's bylaws, meticulously drafted by Walter, we had included a defense mechanism, a clause that allowed, with my sole digital signature, to transfer total administration and usufruct of the lands to an agricultural conservation trust in perpetuity, blocking any possibility of sale, subdivision, or commercial hotel use. If we activate Document B and transfer the rights to the trust, the land is shielded. No one, not even you, will be able to sell a single square foot to an external investor ever again. It will remain exclusively for traditional agricultural use. It's an irreversible decision. This land is not for sale, Walter. Not today, not tomorrow, not when I'm under the earth. Arthur poured his life into these furrows. If Claire wants money, let her work for it, but she won't use her father's bones to pay for her luxuries. Prepare the digital document. Send it to me through the secure portal. I'll sign it right now with my cryptographic token. Understood, Eleanor? Walter said, his voice regaining its professional firmness, now tinged with deep respect. Give me 20 minutes to generate the act, link it to the trust registry, and send you the encrypted link. Have your USB device handy. And Eleanor, yes, Walter, Arthur would be very proud of you. He always knew you were the stronger of the two. Thank you, Walter. I'll await the email. I hung up the call. I placed the phone on the desk and stood up from the chair. I walked to my room's window and drew back the heavy curtain by just an inch. From there, I had a clear view of the west side of the ranch, where the land sloped gently down towards the creek. In the distance, I saw two figures walking among the trees. It was Claire and Mr. Hayes. He walked, gesticulating, pointing with both hands at the open space, surely imagining cabins with glass windows where our cows now grazed. She walked beside him, nodding, laughing that false, complacent laugh she had learned in the city. The pain tried to resurface, a sting in my throat, as I watched her walk on the land that had given her birth, selling it with every step, but I pushed it down. I picked up my phone again. I needed to secure the perimeter. I dialed Miguel's number. Miguel was the ranch foreman, a 60-year old man with skin weathered like old leather and hands rough as sandpaper. He had worked with Arthur since they were boys. He lived in the small service house near the main entrance and knew every stone, every well, and every wire on our property. He had no university degrees or expensive suits, but his loyalty to this land was deeper than any contract. Boss lady, Miguel answered on the first ring. In the background, I could hear the sound of the water pump engine. Miguel, turn off the pump for a minute and listen carefully, I said. My voice brooked no argument. The engine noise ceased almost immediately. Yes, Mrs. Eleanor, I'm here. The guest Claire brought, the man in the suit, they're walking towards the creek by the old walnut trees. I don't want them to go past the stone fence, and under no circumstances are you to let that man bring a tape measure, a drone, or any measuring device onto our soil. If they ask, tell them the wooden bridge is rotten and dangerous. And Miguel, yes, boss lady, lock the north gate and let the big dogs loose in that sector. Have them patrol there. No one goes into the sheds, no one checks the tractors. The ranch is closed today. I heard Miguel let out a deep breath, a sound of absolute understanding. He didn't need long explanations. He had watched Claire grow up. He had seen her disdain for us in recent years. Miguel knew exactly what was happening, just by the tone of my voice. Understood, Mrs. Eleanor. They won't pass the stone fence, and the dogs will be let loose in the north right away. Don't worry, we'll take care of what's ours here. Thank you, Miguel. I hung up. I looked out the window again. Indeed, a couple of minutes later, I saw Miguel's broad, stooped figure emerge from among the fruit trees and walk directly towards where Claire and Mr. Hayes were, intercepting them before they reached the walnut grove. I couldn't hear what he said to them, but I saw Mr. Hayes stop dead in his tracks, visibly annoyed, and Claire cross her arms in frustration. Miguel stood there, unmoving, a human barrier of earth and loyalty that city money could not breach. I turned to go back to the computer, but a sound stopped me. Light footsteps in the wooden hallway, the unmistakable creak of the loose board in front of my room door. Claire had returned to the house. A few seconds later, 3 soft knocks sounded on the solid wood of my door. "Mom, are you in there?" My daughter's voice sounded muffled, with that childish, sweet tone she used when she wanted to ask me for money to go out with her friends in adolescence. I didn't answer immediately. I walked silently to the door. My breathing was calm. My pulse was a Swiss clock. I turned the brass bolt with a quick movement and opened the door abruptly, giving her no time to retreat. Claire stood in the doorway with a tense smile painted on her lips. Her eyes quickly scanned my face, searching for traces of tears, for the fragile, offended old woman she expected to find. She found none of that. My face was a mask of absolute neutrality. "Mom, you scared me, leaving the porch like that," she said, taking a step forward and trying to touch my arm. I moved an inch backward, just enough for her hand to hang in the air before she let it drop. Mr. Hayes felt a little uncomfortable. "He thought you didn't want to receive us." I told him you were probably tired from the heat. "You know how you get this time of day with the heat. The heat doesn't tire me, Claire. I've worked under this sun for 40 years, I replied, my voice flat, devoid of any emotional inflection. "I came to get a headache pill, nothing more." Claire seemed relieved. Her posture relaxed. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and the predatory smile returned to the corners of her mouth. "Oh, poor Mum. You just work too hard. That's why I always tell you that you need to rest. Stop worrying about so many things." She leaned against the doorframe, crossing her ankles with that casual elegance she had practiced so much. The smell of her imported perfume, sweet and cloying, tried to invade my room, but it clashed against the smell of beeswax and old wood that always governed my space. "Speaking of which, Mom," she began, her tone becoming more casual, too rehearsed. "Next week, I'm coming back with a friend from the office, a lawyer." I stared at her intently. I didn't blink. "A lawyer? Why do we need a lawyer on the ranch, Claire? Things are in order here. Your father didn't leave any debts." No, it's not about debts, Mom." "Don't worry," she hastened to say, raising a hand as if calming a frightened animal. "It's boring stuff. Mandatory county paperwork to update agricultural taxes. You know how the government is, always inventing new forms to squeeze money out of us. If we don't do it, they can hit us with a huge fine." The same words, the exact same script she had recited to Mr. Hayes on the porch. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression blank. "Ah, mandatory paperwork," I repeated slowly, savoring the lie in the air. "I don't understand those modern things anymore, dear. So many papers, so many signatures, it makes my head spin." Claire's eyes gleamed with a flash of absolute triumph. She had heard exactly what she wanted to hear. The confirmation of my weakness, the proof that her plan was perfect. "Exactly, Mom. Don't break your head trying to understand it. They're confusing legal terms. Pure bureaucracy. I'll take care of everything. You just have to sign where the lawyer tells you, and that's it. I'll assume all responsibility. I'll relieve you of that burden. That way you can dedicate yourself to your plants and resting. Does that sound good?" The cynicism of her words was so dense it could almost be touched. She was asking me to hand her the weapon with which she intended to execute me, and she was asking for it with a smile of filial love. "Sounds perfect, Claire," I said, maintaining eye contact. "Bring the papers next week. I'll sign exactly what's appropriate." "That's great, Mom," she exclaimed, patting the door frame softly. "You'll see, you'll have a huge weight lifted off your shoulders. Well, I'll let you rest. I'm going to see if Miguel will let us go down to the creek. He got a little stubborn out there." She turned and started walking down the hallway. her high heels echoing like hammer blows against the wooden floor. She didn't say goodbye again. She had what she wanted. She had dismissed me. I watched her disappear down the hallway towards the light of the porch. I closed my bedroom door. I turned the bolt again. Click. The silence returned, but this time it was an electric silence. I walked towards the oak desk. I sat down in front of the laptop. An envelope icon blinked in the bottom corner of the screen. Walter Arkwright was a man of his word. The email had arrived. I opened the message. The subject read, Document B, San Julio Trust Activation Urgent. I connected the small black USB device, my encrypted digital signature token, to the laptop's side port. The red light on the device lit up, awaiting my orders. I opened the attached link in the email. The legal document unfolded on the screen. It was 10 pages of impeccable legal jargon, a steel lock forged with words that Walter had prepared years ago for this exact moment. The irrevocable clause, the total transfer of commercial exploitation rights to the Conservation Trust. Once signed, neither I nor Claire nor any investor in a shining suit could alter the destiny of this land. It would be field, sow, and harvest until the end of time. I moved the cursor to the end of the last page. There was a blue box that said Insert Digital Signature. I thought of Arthur. I thought of his hands cracked by the cold, his back bent under the weight of seed bags. I thought of the first time we saw the green leaves of the walnut trees sprout. And then I thought of Claire laughing on the porch, calling me old, calling me useless, preparing the papers to dispossess us. I clicked the blue box. The system asked for the security pin for my cryptographic device. I placed my fingers, those swollen, arthritic fingers, supposedly only good for kneading dough, on the keyboard. I entered the 8 numbers with lethal precision. I pressed the enter key. The screen froze for a fraction of a second, processing, and then a bright green stamp appeared over the document, accompanied by a message in the center of the screen. Signature validated. Document registered and successfully sent to the state registry. Operation irreversible. I leaned back in the wooden chair. Outside, Claire was still trying to convince Miguel to let her go down to the creek, believing the land she was walking on was already hers. She had no idea that with a single click in the silence of my room, she had just turned her millionaire empire into a pile of dust in the wind. Everything was done, and now all that remained was for her to bring the rope herself next week. The bright green stamp remained on the computer screen for several minutes, blinking softly with the system's confirmation. The word irreversible stared back at me from the center of the digital document, firm, unmoving, carved into the provincial registry's code with the same force with which Arthur had carved our names into the trunk of the old oak in the backyard. The hum of the machine's fan was the only sound in the room. I felt no relief, no triumph, no joy. I felt the cold, absolute weight of an iron door closing forever. I had saved the land, but in doing so, I had finally accepted that the daughter I remembered, the little girl with scraped knees, no longer existed. I reached to the side of the computer and pulled out the small USB device. The red light instantly went out. The connection to the government portal was cut. I closed the laptop lid with a slow movement, listening to the faint creak of the plastic hinges. I took the cold, black token in my arthritic fingers and walked to the cherrywood dresser next to the mirror. I opened the first drawer where I kept my linen handkerchiefs and the few pieces of jewelry I never wore. At the bottom, hidden under a fine wool shawl, was a small carved wooden box that Arthur had given me on our first anniversary. Inside rested his old pocket watch, stopped at 3:15 since the day his heart failed. I placed the USB device next to the watch, metal against metal. Time stopped beside the tool that had just secured our future. I closed the box, closed the drawer, and looked at myself in the mirror for a second. My grey hair was perfectly pinned up, my blouse buttoned to the neck. There were no tears in my eyes, no trembling in my hands. The weakness Claire expected to exploit did not reside in this body. I turned around, walked to the door, and twisted the brass bolt. The click echoed loudly in the silent hallway. I left the room and walked back towards the outdoor porch. The sun had already begun its descent behind the irregular line of the hills, painting the sky a furious orange that presaged more heat for the coming days. The air had lost a little of its oppressive weight, and a dry breeze began to rustle the eucalyptus leaves. I pushed the double doors open and stepped onto the porch. The green porcelain cups were still on the iron table, with the remnants of cold, dark coffee at the bottom. The lemon pound cake was untouched. In the distance, on the path that led up from the creek area, I saw Claire and Mr. Hayes appear. They walked quickly, but not with the light step of a country stroll. Rather, with the heavy, clumsy gait of those who are deeply frustrated. Mr. Hayes was a few paces ahead. His impeccably grey suit no longer looked so perfect. The hems of his pants were covered in a thin layer of yellowish dust, and one of his expensive shoes had a dark smudge of dried mud on the toe. He wiped a white handkerchief across his sweaty forehead, muttering things that the wind kept me from hearing. Claire trotted behind him, trying to maintain her balance in her high heels on the uneven ground. Her arms were crossed, and her face was contorted in a grimace of absolute disgust. When they saw me standing on the porch by the coffee table, Mr. Hayes paused for a second, adjusted the non-existent knot of his tie, and forced a tense smile that didn't reach his eyes. I stood motionless, my hands crossed in front of my apron, waiting for them. "Mrs. Eleanor," Mr. Hayes said as he reached the foot of the wooden porch steps, breathing heavily, "what challenging terrain you have down there. Your foreman is a very peculiar man, very zealous about his work, it seems. Miguel knows his business, Mr. Hayes. This land is not a park for strolling. There are old wells, treacherous routes. He only ensures no one gets hurt," I replied, my voice flat, serene, without a trace of apology. Claire stomped up the steps, digging her heels into the wood. She stopped beside me, breathing agitatedly, and looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and condescension. "Mom, that old man is completely crazy. He let the dogs loose on us in the north pasture and stood in our way to the creek, saying the bridge was rotten. They almost bit Mr. Hayes' pants off. We'll have to retire him soon. He's too old to be deciding who passes and who doesn't on our own property. Our own property." The ease with which she used the plural caused a metallic knot in my stomach. The same house she planned to snatch from me with a paper full of legal traps. "Miguel will retire when his legs can no longer hold him, Claire. In the meantime, he's the one who guards the gates," I said, looking directly into my daughter's dark eyes. I didn't lower my gaze, nor soften my tone. For a fleeting moment, I saw a shadow of doubt cross Claire's face, a flicker of confusion at my firmness, accustomed as she was to my submissive silences and soft assents. But the arrogance of the city immediately covered it again. She shook her head, dismissing my words with a contemptuous wave of her hand. "Whatever you say, Mom, we're not going to argue about staff now. Hayes needs to get back to the city before dark. He has an important dinner with other investors." Mr. Hayes was already halfway to the enormous black vehicle. He opened the driver's door and turned towards us, nodding briefly. "It's been a very enlightening afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor. The place has enormous potential, enormous. We'll talk more later." "Excuse me." He got into the car and closed the door with a dull, heavy thud. Claire approached me and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. Her sweet perfume mingled with the smell of cold sweat and frustration. "See you next week, Mom. Remember what we talked about. I'm bringing my lawyer friend to sign that county paperwork. Don't forget to have your ID handy. Yes, it's a quick procedure. It won't take more than 10 minutes. I'll be waiting for you here, Claire." "With the papers on the table," I replied. She smiled, satisfied. She believed my confirmation was the final surrender of an exhausted old woman. She turned, carefully descended the steps, and got into the passenger seat of the black vehicle. The engine roared, kicking up a thick cloud of golden dust from the gravel, and the large dark car disappeared down the path bordered by hydrangeas, vanishing from sight towards the main road. I remained on the porch, watching the dust slowly settle over the green leaves. Silence returned to the ranch, heavy and absolute. I heard the crunch of work boots approaching from the side of the house. Miguel appeared around the corner with his straw hat in his hand and his weathered face covered in dirt. He stopped at the foot of the steps, looking in the direction the car had gone. "They left, boss lady," he said, his voice hoarse and slow. "They left, Miguel. You did a good job. What were they looking at down there?" Miguel spat to the side onto the dry earth, a gesture of contempt he rarely used. The man in the suit was pacing the distance between the old walnut trees and the creek bed. He was telling Miss Claire that there was room for at least 10 wooden platforms there, that they had to clear the entire west row to have an unobstructed view of the mountain. Miss Claire was agreeing to everything, saying there was no problem, that those trees were old and didn't yield many walnuts anymore. I felt my blood pound in my temples. The walnut trees on the west side, the trees Arthur and I had planted during the worst drought of the ATS. I remembered my husband carrying buckets of water from the well at 3 a.m. His hands cracked and bleeding from the cold so the saplings wouldn't die. I remembered how we sat in the mud, exhausted and embracing, when we saw the first green sprouts survive the frost. Those trees weren't old wood. They were the flesh and bones of our history, and my daughter was willing to turn them into planks for a stranger's balcony. I turned my face and looked towards the old wooden shed, the one Claire had pointed to with such disdain upon arrival. The double door was ajar, showing the gloom inside. In the exact center of the shed, there was an empty space on the packed dirt floor, a perfect square where the earth was darker. It was where the John Deere tractor used to be parked. Memory assailed me without asking permission. Sharp and cruel. It was a cold March morning, almost 20 years ago. Claire had just turned 18 and had her bags packed. Shiny canvas bags that clashed with the worn walls of our house. She wanted to go to the best private university in the city. She wanted an apartment near downtown, new books, clothes that didn't smell of wood smoke. We didn't have that kind of money in the bank. Arthur had spent 2 entire nights sitting in the kitchen, crunching numbers in a black-covered notebook, rubbing his red-rimmed eyes until they almost hurt. On the 3rd day, he called a machinery buyer from the neighboring town. I saw the scene projected in the empty space of the shed. I saw the burly man counting stacks of bills on the green hood of the tractor. I saw Arthur signing the bill of sale with a hand that trembled slightly. That tractor was his pride, the tool that saved him weeks of back pain during planting season. As he handed over the keys, Arthur bowed his head and ran his calloused hand over the cold metal one last time, silently bidding farewell to the machine that fed him. Claire stood near the door, looking at her wristwatch, impatient. She didn't even look at the tractor, nor did she look at her father's drawn face. When the man handed the envelope of money to Arthur, he walked directly to her and placed it in her hands. "It's for your future, my girl. Study hard, be great," Arthur had said with a sad smile, but full of hope. Claire had taken the envelope, quickly put it in her purse and said, "Thanks, Dad. It was time to get out of this mud pit. I'll be someone important in the city." That day, Arthur stood at the ranch entrance, watching the bus drive away, until it became a tiny dot on the horizon. He never bought a new tractor. He went back to plowing with the old machinery, the one that got stuck every 2 hours, the one that destroyed the discs in his spine year after year, until his body gave out. He gave his health to buy her a seat at the table of those who today wore grey suits and tried to dispossess us. The future Arthur had bought with his sweat was the guillotine now hanging over my head. I clenched my fists on my apron until my knuckles turned white. The sadness I had felt in the room completely evaporated, consumed by a cold, silent fire. The Sentinel had taken absolute control. "Those trees are not to be touched, Miguel," I said. My voice cut through the afternoon air like a sharp knife. "Neither the west ones, nor the south ones. Not a single branch." "I know, boss lady." "Over my dead body will a chainsaw be brought here?" "It won't come to that, Miguel. They won't even have time to start the engine." I turned around and began collecting the green porcelain cups from the table. I stacked them carefully on the silver tray. The crystalline sound of the china clinking softly seemed to clear the air. Miguel stood at the foot of the steps, awaiting instructions. He knew that when I started tidying up, my mind was drawing battle lines. "Miguel, listen carefully. Next Tuesday, Claire will return. She'll bring a lawyer from the city. You want me to lock the main gate, Mrs. Eleanor? Block the road with the old truck?" "No, quite the opposite. On Tuesday, I want you to open both leaves of the large iron gate, the main entrance. Leave them wide open from the morning. Let them find not a single lock, not a single dog in their way. Let the black car come right up to the house door without stopping. Let them enter comfortably, Miguel. Let them believe they have a clear path." Miguel stared at me intently, his small, dark eyes framed by deep wrinkles, narrowed. He didn't understand the tactic, but he understood the tone. He nodded slowly. "As you command, boss lady. Gates open. Anything else? Yes? On Tuesday at noon, I want you to put on your clean shirt and come to the porch. You'll stand by the hallway door. In silence. I just want you to be present. Let them see that I'm not alone in this house, even if they think my signature is worth nothing. I'll be there, firm as a post, Mrs. Eleanor. Don't you worry." Miguel put on his hat, turned around, and walked towards the corrals, his figure disappearing into the long shadows that already covered half the yard. I picked up the heavy tray and entered the house. I went directly to the kitchen. I washed the green cups, the crystal plate, the milk pitcher. I washed everything with boiling water and white soap, scrubbing hard, as if I could erase the breath of betrayal from the porcelain. I dried each piece with a clean cloth and put them away on the highest shelf of the dining room hutch. I closed the glass doors. Those cups would never see the light of day for Claire again. The following days passed, with the thick slowness of molasses. Time seemed to stretch on the ranch, but I didn't stay still, waiting for the blow. I dedicated myself to physical work with an intensity I hadn't demanded of myself in years. I needed to feel the earth under my nails. I needed the dull ache in my back muscles at the end of the day to remind me exactly what I was defending. On Wednesday, I rose before dawn and went to the backyard orchard, pruning the rose bushes, cutting the dry branches with the large, wooden-handled shears. Every snip of the metal blade cutting dead wood was a decision made. On Thursday, I cleaned the filters of the large water pump, plunging my hands into the icy water and dark mud of the channel. On Friday, I walked to the southern boundary of the property, checking the barbed wire fence inch by inch, making sure the cabraco posts were firm in place. The ranch spoke to me in the crunchy language of dry leaves and the tapping of woodpeckers. It told me it was alive, that it resisted, that it would not let itself be paved over for a wad of bills and a contract drafted in the city. Claire didn't call all week. Her silence was calculated. She wanted to keep a low profile, not raise suspicions, let the ignorant old woman continue watering her plants in peace until the moment to present her with the fatal paper. I didn't call her either. The black cell phone rested on my desk, mute and cold. I only used it on Saturday afternoon to send a short message to Walter Arkwright. All set on my end. See you Tuesday. A ceiling of low, grey clouds covered the valley, trapping the heat and making the air feel heavy, difficult to breathe. It was typical weather before a strong summer storm, the kind that makes window panes rattle. I got out of bed at 6 a.m. I didn't put on my kitchen apron. I didn't beat eggs with sugar. I didn't grate lemons. The clay oven remained cold and unlit. I went to the closet and took out a dark, thick fabric dress, one I used to wear to church on important Sundays. I buttoned it carefully, brushed my hair in front of the mirror, and gathered it into a tight bun at the nape of my neck, securing it with metal pins so not a single grey strand came loose. I put on my lace-up shoes, the closed ones, the ones that make noise when walking on wood. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was no longer the mother awaiting a visit. I was the owner of San Julio Ranch. I left my room and walked towards the main dining room. It was an enormous room located in the center of the house with high windows overlooking the side porch. In the middle, dominating the space, was a rectangular table of solid, long, heavy oak, surrounded by 8 high-backed chairs. It was the table where Arthur and I sat to review accounting ledgers on winter nights. It was a work table, not a celebration table. I took a cotton cloth and polished the surface of the wood until I could see my own dark reflection in it. I didn't put a tablecloth. I didn't put out flower arrangements. I went to the kitchen, took a clear glass pitcher, filled it with cold filtered water, and placed it exactly in the center of the oak table. Beside it, I placed 4 plain glass tumblers, unadorned, common. That was all they would receive from me this time. Clear, cold water. I walked to the head of the table, the chair that faced away from the hallway, and looked directly towards the front door. I sat down, the firm wood of the backrest supporting my spine. I placed my hands with short, clean nails flat on the oak surface. The house was in absolute silence. The pendulum clock in the corner of the dining room marked the seconds with a metallic, constant rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. At 10:30 am, I heard the dogs bark in the distance, near the main gates. They weren't attack barks, but a warning that something had crossed the property line. Miguel had kept his word. The gates were wide open. 5 minutes later, the unmistakable sound of thick tires crushing the gravel of the driveway broke the stillness of the house. The black car advanced slowly, confidently, gliding down the road that my husband's sweat had built, approaching the main door without resistance. The engine died. I heard the thud of the doors closing. I heard footsteps on the porch. I heard Claire's sharp voice giving a low instruction. I didn't move. I kept my hands flat on the table. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of wax and old wood, feeling the block of ice in my chest solidify completely. The trap was set, the net taut, and the guests had just stepped over the threshold. Now, all that remained was to let them speak. The creak of the main door hinges broke the silence of the house with the violence of thunder. I didn't move. I kept my hands resting on the cold surface of the oak table, feeling every grain of the wood under my fingertips. Footsteps echoed in the entrance hallway. First, the sharp, quick tapping of Claire's heels, anxious, setting a rhythm of urgency. Behind her, a heavier, firm step, the unmistakable sound of hard-soled shoes, expensive leather, treading on my house's floor, as if they were already walking on conquered territory. "Mum?" Claire called from the hallway, her voice bouncing off the high walls with that plastic, rehearsed cheerfulness that churned my stomach. "We're here. Why is it so dark in here, for goodness sake? It looks like night." She appeared in the dining room doorway. She wore a fitted, impeccable navy blue silk dress, without a single wrinkle despite the drive from the city. Her brown hair fell perfectly straightened over her shoulders. Behind her emerged the lawyer. He was a young man, no more than 35, with slicked back hair and a tailored dark blue suit that screamed quick money and arrogance. He carried a black leather briefcase in one hand and his cell phone in the other. His eyes quickly scanned the dining room, evaluating the antique furniture, the heavy curtains, the wrought iron lamp hanging from the ceiling. His gaze held no appreciation for history. He only appraised antiques. "It's to keep the morning cool, Claire," I replied, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Today's heat will be heavy. Come in, sit down." Claire advanced towards the table, followed closely by the man. She chose the chair to my right. He settled to my left, placing the briefcase on the table with a dry thud. The oak wood, which had endured decades of work, family dinners, and tears, received the lawyer's black leather as a silent offense. "Mom, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Sterling," Claire said, gesturing to the man with a smile that failed to hide the tension in her jaw. "He's one of the partners at the law firm that advises our company, a top professional. He made a space in his schedule to come all the way out here and help us with this cumbersome paperwork." Mr. Sterling extended a hand with perfectly manicured nails. His smile was sharp, rehearsed in front of a mirror to project confidence and superiority. "Mrs. Eleanor, a true pleasure to meet you," he said with a deep, velvety voice. "Your daughter has told me wonders about you and this property. It's a picturesque place, very rustic. I perfectly understand why it's so hard for you to deal with modern bureaucracy from out here. That's what we're for." I did not shake his hand. Instead, I took the clear glass pitcher from the center of the table and began to pour water into the plain glasses. The sound of cold water falling against the glass filled the dining room. "Doctor," Sterling slowly withdrew his hand, pretending not to care about the snub, but I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. "I'm not serving coffee today," I said, pushing a glass towards Claire and another towards him. "It's too hot for hot drinks. Clear water is better. It refreshes and hides nothing." Claire let out a nervous giggle, taking the glass without drinking. "Oh, Mom, always with your quirks," she murmured, glancing at me, searching my face for any sign of resistance, but finding only the same stone mask I'd maintained all week. "Well, as I told you on the phone, we don't want to take up much of your time. We know you have your routines, your plants to water, and all that." Mr. Sterling brought the county forms. The lawyer nodded as if given the signal to begin his performance. He opened the metal latches of his briefcase. The sound was a sharp snap in the silent room. He took out a thick, dark blue cardboard folder and placed it on the table. He opened it with calculated slowness, revealing a stack of white papers printed with dense paragraphs and small print. Mrs. Eleanor, I'll be very brief so as not to bore you with technical terminology that, frankly, no one is interested in, Mr. Sterling began, intertwining his fingers on the table and looking at me with a condescension that burned my blood. The county government has updated the tax matrix for rural properties over 50 acres. If you do not submit an updated declaration of ownership by Friday, the ranch will fall into a retroactive penalty category. We're talking about figures that could compromise the viability of your harvests. I kept my gaze fixed on his eyes. I didn't blink, I didn't nod. I just let his lies float in the dense air of the dining room. Claire, being such a devoted daughter and concerned about your well-being, asked me to draft this document, the lawyer continued, sliding the papers across the table until they were right in front of me. It's a management delegation. Basically, you sign here, and we take care of fighting with the county, paying the fees, and saving you from fines. You lose nothing. On the contrary, you gain peace of mind. You won't have to think about numbers or government offices again. Claire leaned forward, placing a hand on my arm. Her touch was cold. It's for your own good, Mum. You've worked too much in your life. Dad wouldn't have wanted you to spend your golden years stressed about taxes and papers you don't understand. Let me take care of you now. Let me assume the responsibility. You just have to put your signature on the last page, and we'll leave and let you rest. I looked at the document. The first page did not have any county letterhead. It had the logo of Mr. Sterling's law firm. My eyes, which had spent thousands of nights reading the fine print of fertilizer contracts and grain sales, quickly scanned the first visible paragraph. There, hidden among a sea of useless legal jargon, were the keywords: special power of attorney, irrevocable, powers of disposition, alienation of real estate, without accountability. It was exactly what Walter had warned me about. It wasn't tax paperwork, it was my financial death sentence. It was the sale of San Julio Ranch, disguised as a filial favor. I raised my right hand and placed my palm flat on the document. I felt the texture of the thick paper, warm from having been in the briefcase. These are a lot of pages for a simple tax form, Mr. Sterling, I said. My voice sounded measured, resonating in the dining room walls. My husband and I paid the taxes on this land for 40 years. They never asked us to sign such a thick document. The lawyer exchanged a quick glance with Claire, a glance that lasted a fraction of a second but was loaded with irritation. He thought I was a 5-minute formality, an old woman who would sign anything to get back to her garden. Laws change, Mrs. Eleanor, Mr. Sterling replied, forcing his sharp smile again, though this time it didn't reach his eyes. Bureaucracy has become more complex. What you have before you is a comprehensive representation mandate. It covers all possible contingencies, so we don't have to bother you again in the future. It's standard procedure. Standard procedure, I repeated slowly, as if savoring the words to see if they were poisoned. And if I put my signature on the last page, as my daughter says, does the land remain mine, or am I signing something else? Claire withdrew her hand from my arm, as if she had been burned. Her posture became rigid. Of course it's still yours, Mom. What are you talking about? Claire interjected, her tone rising an octave, tinged with fabricated indignation. Do you think I'd make you sign something bad? I'm offended that you doubt me. I brought you one of the best lawyers from the city to save you from a problem, and you start asking questions as if you were an auditor. You don't have to understand every word of the paper. That's what he's for. I read what I signed, Claire. I always have, I replied without raising my voice. Mr. Sterling let out a short, heavy sigh, pulling a silver pen from the inner pocket of his jacket. He uncapped it with a fluid motion and placed it on the table next to the document. Mrs. Eleanor, with all due respect, time is pressing. I have hearings in the city this afternoon. I give you my word as a legal professional that this document is strictly for the management of your assets in front of the collecting entities. There is nothing shady here. Your daughter loves you and only wants to protect you from your own administrative fatigue. Sign here on the dotted line, and we'll take care of the rest. At that precise instant, I heard the deep, rhythmic sound of work boots approaching down the hallway. Miguel appeared in the dining room doorway. He wore his clean button-down shirt tucked into dark canvas pants and held his straw hat in his calloused hands. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there, filling the space with his broad, heavy presence, his eyes fixed on the city lawyer. Mr. Sterling turned in his chair, startled by the foreman's silent appearance. "What does this man want?" the lawyer asked, his voice losing some of its professional polish, revealing a note of genuine nervousness. "That's Miguel, the ranch foreman," I said, not moving my hand from the document. "He's here because, in this house, decisions are never made behind closed doors. He is a witness to everything that happens on this land." Claire rolled her eyes, huffing with contained fury. "Mom, this is a private family matter. Tell your employee to go to the corrals. He's interrupting us." "Miguel stays where he is," I replied, my tone cutting the air like an invisible whip. The pendulum clock in the dining room corner struck 11 a.m., and just as the last metallic chime echoed, the sound of a second engine broke the stillness. It wasn't a soft, quiet engine like Claire's black car. It was the hoarse, constant roar of an older, stronger vehicle, accustomed to dirt and mud roads. Claire frowned and turned her head towards the window, trying to see through the curtains. "Were you expecting someone, Mum?" she asked. The first note of true alarm crept into her voice. "In the country, the doors are always open for old friends," I replied. We heard the engine turn off, then the sound of a vehicle door closing firmly. The footsteps on the porch resonated differently. They weren't hurried heels or polished shoes trying to escape the dust. They were the firm, slow, deliberate steps of a man who knew this house as well as I did. Miguel stepped aside from the doorway, yielding the path with a respectful nod. Walter Arkwright entered the dining room. He wore his characteristic charcoal grey suit, perfectly pressed despite the day's humidity, and carried his own worn leather briefcase. His white hair was combed back, and his face, marked by decades of reading documents and sealing fates, reflected the absolute seriousness of a judge about to deliver a verdict. Mr. Sterling paled. The sharp smile disappeared from his face as if it had been ripped away. He recognized the notary instantly. In our state's legal circle, Walter Arkwright's signature carried more weight than any seal from a city law firm. "Good morning, Eleanor," Walter said. His deep, resonant voice filled the room. He walked to the table and stopped in front of me, completely ignoring the other two. I apologized for the delay. There was a fallen tree on the county road. "You're just in time, Walter, as always," I replied, finally removing my hand from the document Claire had brought. Claire shot up from her seat, pushing the oak chair back with a violent screech that hurt the ears. Her face was red, disfigured by the fury of seeing her plan interrupted. "What is this man doing here, Mum?" she cried, pointing a trembling finger at Walter. "I told you I was bringing Mr. Sterling to handle the county matter. We don't need your country notary poking his nose where it doesn't belong. This is Dad's company business." Walter slowly turned his head and looked at Claire. His grey eyes were cold as ice on a July dawn. "Arthur didn't leave any company, Claire. He left a working ranch. And your mother asked me to be present to review any document that you or your advisor." Walter looked at the young lawyer with deep contempt put before her. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. He stood up, buttoning his jacket with a nervous gesture, trying to project an authority that had already slipped through his fingers. "Dr. Arkwright, it's an honor." "I know your reputation, Mr. Sterling said, his tone now syrupy and defensive. "But your presence here is unnecessary. This is a simple mandate for tax management that Mrs. Eleanor is about to sign voluntarily. A minor administrative matter." Walter didn't reply. He extended a hand towards the table. "Allow me to see that management mandate, Eleanor," he said. I slid the blue folder across the oak table into his hands. Walter took his reading glasses from his jacket pocket, put them on slowly, and began to read. The silence in the dining room became absolute, crushing. Only the rustle of paper in the notary's hands and Claire's agitated breathing could be heard. Mr. Sterling swallowed audibly. He was trapped, and he knew it. Walter read the first page, turned to the second. His eyes quickly scanned the dense paragraphs. When he reached the third page, he let out a dry laugh, devoid of any humor. a sound that resembled the crackle of a dead branch. "You are very audacious, Mr. Sterling," Walter said, lowering the document and looking at the young lawyer over the rim of his glasses. "Or very foolish. A minor administrative matter? What you have brought to this house is an irrevocable special power of attorney, with an indemnity clause, total cession of usufruct rights, and explicit powers for the alienation, sale, or subdivision of cadastral parcel number 412, that is, San Julio Ranch in its entirety." Claire opened her mouth to speak, but Walter raised a hand, stopping her dead. If Eleanor had signed this paper, the notary continued, his voice rising in volume, vibrating with an indignation. "I myself felt in my bones, you, Claire, would have had the legal authority to sell this land to Mr. Hayes tomorrow without your mother being able to stop it. You would have left her on the street, stripped of her home, her livelihood, and her husband's memory, all protected by a document drafted with malice and presented under false pretenses. The blow was precise. The naked truth thrown onto the oak table illuminated my daughter's betrayal with blinding clarity. Claire looked at me. Her eyes no longer held fury. Now they held the panic of a cornered animal. "Mom, it's not like that. He doesn't understand. Mr. Hayes was going to give us a lot of money. We both would have lived like queens in the city. I wanted what was best for you. Dad would have wanted us to get ahead." The excuse was so pathetic, so empty, that I didn't even bother to feel anger. The block of ice in my chest was perfectly firm. I stood up slowly, placed both hands on the table, and leaned forward, looking directly at the woman I had carried in my womb. "Don't use your father's name at this table, Claire," my voice said, sounding deeper, darker than I had heard it in years. "Your father broke his back to pay for your education. He sacrificed his health so you could have a degree. And you used that degree to bring a man in a suit to my house, to sit on my porch, to plan how they would rip out the walnut trees we planted with our own hands. You don't know what you're talking about," Claire shrieked, tears of frustration welling in her eyes, completely losing her composure. "You don't understand how the world works now, Mom. This land is worth nothing if it's not exploited. Mr. Hayes was going to put in millions, and you ruined everything because you're stubborn, because you're ignorant." I let her screams echo off the walls. I let her contempt fill the room. And then, with absolute calm, with the precision of a surgeon sinking the scalpel, I delivered the blow. "You're right, Claire," I said, my voice soft but laden with the weight of an avalanche. "This land will be yours very soon, won't it? After all, the old lady doesn't understand business, or what she's even walking on." Claire's face froze, color drained from her cheeks, leaving her an unhealthy white. Her eyes widened as my words, her own words, the ones she had spoken on the porch thinking I wasn't listening, lodged in her throat. She took a step back, tripping over her chair leg. "Did you think I was deaf, Claire?" I continued, slowly circling the table, approaching her as Mr. Sterling instinctively retreated. "Did you think that because I dress plainly and bake, I don't know how to lock a gate?" I turned my head towards the lawyer, who was frantically trying to put his papers back in his briefcase. "Mr. Sterling," I said, stopping his hands with the tone of my voice, "since you have your cell phone there, and since you are such a diligent professional, I suggest you go to the state registry portal. Right now. Look up the ownership status of San Julio Ranch." The lawyer looked at me, confused, terror throbbing in his neck. He looked at Walter, who nodded slowly, confirming my order. With trembling hands, Mr. Sterling unlocked his phone. His fingers typed hurriedly on the bright screen. The dining room fell into a suffocating silence, interrupted only by the tick-tock of the clock and Claire's choked breathing. A few seconds later, the lawyer's face transformed. His eyes scanned his phone screen, going down line after line, and his mouth opened slightly in an expression of absolute disbelief. "It can't be, Mr." Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. This is impossible, the system says." "What does the system say, Doctor?" Walter asked, crossing his arms, savoring the moment with the patience of an old man. "Mr." Sterling looked up from his phone, staring at Claire as if she were a ghost, and then looked at me with a mixture of dread and respect I will never forget. The system indicates that the complete parcel was transferred 5 days ago. The exploitation rights are blocked. San Julio Ranch has been registered under an agricultural conservation trust in perpetuity, digitally signed by the majority shareholder of the owning corporation. The lawyer swallowed, sweat gleaming on his forehead. The land is inalienable. It cannot be sold, it cannot be subdivided, nothing can be built that is not for agricultural use. The title is shielded. Claire let out a choked sound, as if all the air had been knocked from her lungs in one blow. She gripped the edge of the oak table to keep from falling. "What?" she stammered, looking at the lawyer desperately. "What are you saying, Sterling? My mum doesn't have any corporation. She doesn't know how to use a digital signature. It's a system error." "It's not an error, Claire," the lawyer said, closing his briefcase with an abrupt snap, his arrogance replaced by the panic of a man who had just lost a millionaire client and who knew his law firm would be ridiculed in front of investors. "The registration is irrevocable, and the cryptographic signature is validated. You made me waste my time. You brought me here under false pretenses. Mr. Hayes is going to destroy my reputation because of this. Mr. Sterling grabbed his briefcase by the handle without bothering to pick up the silver pen he had left on the table. He didn't say goodbye. He walked past Miguel, who slowly stepped aside, leaving the path clear. We heard the lawyer's quick, clumsy footsteps fleeing down the hallway, the bang of the front door, and seconds later the sound of a car engine starting an emergency on the gravel path. Claire was left alone in front of me, in front of Walter, in front of Miguel, alone in front of the oak table, where her father had counted pennies to buy her books. I looked her up and down. I saw her expensive silk dress, her designer shoes, her perfect hands that had never touched the earth that fed her, and I saw her empire of lies collapsed on my dining room floor. "The old lady did understand business, Claire," I said. My voice dropped to a cold whisper that cut through the air more sharply than any shout. "She understood enough to know that the real thief never comes through the window. He comes through the front door, smiling, and calls you Mum." Claire sobbed, a raw, broken sound, devoid of any dignity. She tried to approach me, extending her hands. "Mom, please, don't do this to me. Mr. Hayes is going to sue me for breach of contract. I already signed a preliminary agreement with him. I put my apartment up as collateral for the topographic surveys. If I don't deliver the land, I lose everything. Mom, please, you can undo this. Tell Walter to undo it." I took a step back, moving away from her touch. I felt no pity, no compassion. I felt the absolute firmness of the Sentinel. "The document is irreversible, Claire, just like what you did today." I turned my back on her. I looked at Miguel, who was still standing by the door, unmoving like an old oak. "Miguel," I said. My voice resonated clear and strong in the room. "Escort the lady out, and when her car passes the main gate, close them. Put on the heavy locks and let the dogs out." "Yes, boss lady," Miguel replied. He took a step towards Claire, pointing down the hallway with a firm gesture of his arm. "This way, ma'am." Claire stood frozen for a second, staring at my back, expecting the weak, sentimental mother to turn around and hug her, to forgive her, to save her from her own greed. But I didn't move. I kept looking at the pitcher of clear water in the center of the oak table. I heard her footsteps dragging towards the exit, heavy, defeated. I heard her suppressed crying fading down the hallway, and finally I heard the definitive thud of the front door closing, sealing the ranch, shutting out the city, the investors, and the woman who was once my daughter. The summer storm was about to break outside, but inside the house, for the first time in years, the air was pure. The echo of the front door closing vibrated in the dining room windows, a dry, definitive sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the room for an instant. I stood by the head of the oak table, my gaze fixed on the transparent water pitcher resting in the center. The water inside trembled slightly, catching the vibrations of the hurried footsteps retreating down the gravel road outside. I didn't move until I heard the roar of Claire's black car engine starting, followed by the harsh grind of tires skidding in her haste to escape the land she had tried to steal. The silence that followed was different from the one that usually inhabited the ranch. It was no longer the heavy silence of waiting or the tense silence of unspoken things. It was a clean, Vast silence, like the one that remains in the field after a hailstorm passes and you go out to check that the roofs are still in place. Walter Arkwright let out a long sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weariness of all his years in the profession. He ran a hand over his face and took off his reading glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger. "She's gone," the notary said, lowering his hand and looking at me with an expression that mingled relief and deep sadness. The sadness of an old man who had just witnessed a family fracture forever. "She's gone, Walter." My voice sounded strangely serene in the spacious dining room, and she took her world of lies with her. At that precise moment, the sky, which had been threatening to crush us all morning under a ceiling of low grey clouds, finally broke. A deafening clap of thunder made the Apache wooden floorboards tremble, and a second later, the rain began to fall. It wasn't a soft drizzle, but a violent downpour, a thick, heavy curtain of water that hit the tin roof of the outer porch with the force of 1,000 tiny hammers. The smell of wet earth, stirred dust, and eucalyptus leaves crushed by the water entered through the window cracks, flooding the house with the oldest perfume I knew. I approached the table and picked up the water pitcher. "Let's go to the kitchen, Walter," I said, turning my back to the front door. "The dining room is too cold for a rainy day. I'll make you real tea, or coffee if you prefer." The water alone was for guests who weren't planning to stay. Walter nodded, collecting his worn leather briefcase with slow movements. I followed him down the hallway. The stormlight darkened the house, but I didn't turn on any lamps. I knew the way by heart, every knot in the wood, every shadow cast by the photograph frames. On reaching the kitchen, the sound of the rain on the roof was even louder, a constant, comforting roar. I put the metal kettle on the gas burner, lit the fire with a match, and took out 2 thick ceramic mugs from the everyday cupboard. Not the green porcelain cups. Those were already stored in their crystal tomb. I took out the everyday mugs, the ones Arthur and I used on winter mornings. We sat at the small pine wood table by the window. Outside, the water poured down, washing the yard, washing the paths, erasing the tire tracks of Claire's car and the lawyer's expensive shoes. "You did the right thing, Eleanor," Walter said suddenly, as I poured hot water over the black tea leaves. "I know the pain is there, even if you don't show it. She's your daughter. You never raise a child thinking that one day you'll have to defend yourself from them with a legal document. But if you hadn't activated that trust, you'd be packing your things in cardboard boxes today." I pushed the steaming mug towards him. The steam rose between us. "There's no pain, Walter. I felt the pain last week when I heard her offering my years and her father's as if they were old junk at a yard sale," I replied, wrapping my hands around my own mug, feeling the warmth of the ceramic transfer to my arthritic knuckles. "What I feel now is clarity. The land is safe. The trees stay where they are. That's all that matters." Walter took a sip of his tea and nodded, respecting my rejection of pity. We talked for a while longer, but not about Claire or betrayals. We talked about seed prices, the rain forecasts for the next month, about the old times when Arthur and he used to sit in that same kitchen arguing politics until they lost their voices. When the storm subsided, reducing to a fine, persistent drizzle, Walter put on his coat, picked up his briefcase, and said goodbye at the back door. I was left alone, truly alone, for the first time since my husband had died, because before, the ghost of hope that my daughter would return kept me company. Now that hope was dead, buried under the weight of an irrevocable power I never signed. I walked back to the dining room to straighten the chairs. As I approached the oak table, a metallic glint caught my attention. It was Mr. Sterling's silver pen. In his haste to escape, in his absolute panic upon realizing that his big millionaire deal had crashed against the wall of an old woman he considered ignorant, he had left his tool of the trade behind. I picked it up between my fingers. It was heavy, cold, engraved with elegant initials on the cap, a pen designed to sign checks with many zeros and contracts that destroyed lives. I didn't put it in a desk drawer. I didn't throw it in the kitchen trash. I went out the back door, walking under the fine drizzle with the pen in my hand, and headed to the old wooden shed, the same shed where we had sold the tractor to pay for Claire's university. Inside, the smell of engine oil and damp earth enveloped me. I walked to Miguel's workbench. There was a rusty can that he used for bent nails, stripped nuts, and useless bits of wire. I dropped Mr. Sterling's silver pen into the can. The expensive metal clinked against the rusty iron with a dull sound. It belonged there, among the scrap that was no longer good for anything. Time on the ranch began to move at a different pace from that day forward. Weeks passed, marked by physical labor and the subtle change in the color of the eucalyptus leaves. Autumn arrived in the valley with frosty mornings and short afternoons, where the sun hid early behind the hills, painting the sky a deep violet. Almost a month after the incident in the dining room, Walter returned to the ranch. This time he didn't wear his charcoal gray suit, but a thick wool sweater and a corduroy jacket. He came on a Saturday morning with the excuse of bringing me the final certified copies of the trust registration for my archives. We sat on the outdoor porch, wrapped in blankets, sipping coffee as we looked towards the walnut grove, which was already beginning to lose its leaves. Walter poured a fresh cup, passed it to me, and gazed at the horizon for a long time before speaking. "I have news from the city, Eleanor," he said finally, his voice low, almost blending with the sound of the wind. "I thought hard about whether to tell you or not, but I think you have a right to know how the things you set in motion ended up." I took a sip of coffee. The brew was at the perfect temperature, bitter and hot. I said nothing, just waited. "Mr. Hayes isn't a man to waste time, let alone money," Walter continued, placing the thermos on the iron table. "The same Tuesday they fled from here, Hayes executed the guarantee clause Claire had signed in the preliminary resort agreement. She had put her downtown apartment up as collateral to cover the costs of the topographic surveys and the project's lost profits. Since she couldn't deliver the land, Hayes legally collected the debt, dispossessing her of the property in less than 15 days. I didn't blink. I stared at the thick trunks of the trees in the distance. "And the lawyer? The one with the silver pen?" I asked, my voice flat. Walter let out a bitter laugh. Mr. Sterling was ridiculed in front of the entire board of investors. He had guaranteed that the acquisition of San Julio Ranch was a mere administrative formality with a disoriented old woman. When Hayes brought the state registry report showing the irrevocable trust, the entire firm panicked. Sterling was removed from the board of directors and, of course, they cut the weakest link. Claire was fired that same afternoon. They blamed her for withholding vital information about her own mother's property status. The wind blew a little harder, rustling the bare branches of the rose bushes in front of the porch. My daughter, the girl who disdained the mud, the woman who mocked my slow hands, had lost her entire glass empire. She had gambled her home and her career, believing she could steal my whole life without meeting resistance, and she had ended up on the street, crushed by the same legal machinery she adored. I heard from a colleague in the city that she's now renting a small room in a peripheral neighborhood, Walter added, glancing at me, searching for any crack in my expression. She tried to call me last week. She wanted me to mediate, to talk to you, to see if you could send her some money from the corporation's account to help her with rent. I told her my phone was exclusively for the ranch's legal matters and hung up. "You did well, Walter," I said, returning the empty mug to him. "The corporation has no funds to finance anyone's greed. Every penny this land produces goes back into the land. She wanted to play by the city's rules, and the city made her pay the price. There's nothing more to discuss on that matter." Walter nodded, accepting my boundary. He didn't mention Claire's name again. We stayed in silence for a while longer, keeping each other company in the tranquility of the countryside until the midday chill forced him to return home. That same winter, the ranch demanded more of me than ever, and I responded with every drop of my energy. The walnut harvest had to be prepared. The trees on the west side, those very trees that Mr. Hayes had measured with his eyes to fell and build his wooden cabins, gave us one of the most abundant seasons I could remember. The branches were heavy, bent almost to the ground under the weight of the green nuts. Miguel hired 5 temporary laborers from the neighboring village to help with the harvest. For 3 weeks, the ranch was a hive of activity. The dull thud of cane poles hitting the high branches, the sound of nuts raining onto the tarp spread on the ground, and the roar of the old tractor's engine carrying the burlap sacks filled my days. I didn't stay in the house knitting or baking cakes. I put on my lined rubber boots, a thick wool coat, and was on site from 6 a.m. until sunset. I helped separate the nuts, my fingers stained black with the natural ink of the green husks, a dark color that got under my nails and wouldn't come off for days. It was the mark of work, the mark of belonging, and I wore it with more pride than any gold ring. But my true battleground wasn't just the wet earth, it was in the numbers. In the afternoons, when the laborers retired to wash their tools and Miguel secured the sheds, I would return to my room, close the door, and open the laptop. Under the blue light of the screen, the slow-handed widow disappeared, and the administrator of San Julio Ranch emerged. I logged into the encrypted management system with my security token, recorded the daily weights of the burlap sacks, cross-referenced the fruit's moisture data, and, most importantly, negotiated directly with buyers. I no longer depended on local intermediaries who used to take advantage of Arthur when he was tired. I contacted a nut exporting company in the city by email, the same city that had tried to devour me. One frosty, bright July morning, an enormous semi-truck with a trailer crossed the main gates that Miguel had opened wide. The vehicle stopped near the storage sheds. The driver, a burly man with a synthetic leather jacket and a clipboard in his hand, jumped out of the cab. He looked around, assessing the facilities with a critical eye. Miguel was organizing the laborers to load the sacks onto the ramp. The driver approached him. "Morning, boss," the trucker said loudly, trying to make himself heard over the still-running engine. "I'm from the Southern Exporters. I have orders to load 8 tons of premium butterfly walnuts. Where's the owner, so I can get the loading receipt signed and arrange payment?" Miguel stopped what he was doing. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and pointed his chin towards the main house's porch. "I'm not the boss, friend," Miguel said with a half-smile under his grizzled mustache. "The owner is Mrs. Eleanor, and you will have to settle the paperwork with her." The trucker turned his head, expecting to see a man in a suit or a male manager. Instead, he saw me. I was standing at the foot of the porch steps. I wore my thick fabric work pants, a grey fleece vest over a plaid shirt, and held my open laptop resting on my left forearm as if it were a tray, while my right hand held the small digital signature device. I walked towards him with a firm step, my boots crunching confidently on the gravel. The man looked me up and down, clearly disconcerted. His mind, accustomed to rural stereotypes, couldn't process the image of an elderly woman with white hair, pulled back in a strict bun, managing the logistics of a high-value commercial shipment. "Good morning. I'm Eleanor, the administrator of the owning corporation," I said, reaching the truck's hood. I placed the computer on the vehicle's cold metal. "I have the loading manifest ready in the system. Before you load the first sack onto the trailer, I need your company's finance department to release the bank transfer agreed upon by email." The trucker blinked, clutching his clipboard. "Oh, yes, Mom. My boss told me payment was on delivery, but I thought we'd have to go to the town bank to do the paperwork." "No need to go anywhere," I interrupted him, my voice crisp and efficient. "Call your boss right now. Tell him the shipment is on the ramp, weighed and moisture certified. Have him release the funds to the account ending in 412. I'll verify the deposit right here and sign your digital receipt." The man, still stunned, took out his cell phone and walked a few steps away to make the call. I saw him nod repeatedly, looking towards me with a new expression of absolute respect. 10 minutes later, the inbox icon on my screen blinked. I opened the bank portal. The green numbers on the account's general balance had grown, reflecting the exact payment, down to the last cent, for the work of our trees. I looked at the driver and gave him an affirmative nod. "Payment confirmed. Miguel, proceed with the loading," I ordered. I stayed there, leaning against the front of the truck, watching as the 50-kilogram sacks went up the ramp one by one. Each sack was a physical testament that the old lady did understand business. Each sack was irrefutable proof that the roots we had planted were stronger than any city ambition. I didn't need to wear expensive suits or use confusing language to protect what was mine. I only needed the patience of one who knows how to sow and the coldness of one who knows when to cut out the weeds by the root. When the truck finally departed, kicking up a cloud of grey dust in the cold afternoon air, silence settled back over the ranch, but this time it was a full, satisfied silence. The laborers collected their cash wages, thanked us, and walked towards the highway. Miguel locked the sheds and let the dogs out, who ran to survey the grounds, happy for the freedom of the end of the day. The sun began to hide behind the mountain range, painting the high clouds with strokes of fire and old gold. The air grew sharp, warning that the night would bring a heavy frost. I walked slowly towards the main house. My legs felt heavy. A deep, honest tiredness ran through my back. The kind of tiredness that allows you to sleep without dreaming. I entered through the kitchen door. The warmth of the wood-burning stove that Miguel had lit early greeted me like a familiar embrace. I placed the laptop on the pine table. There were no more emails to send or records to check. The work was done, the harvest was sold, the land was safe. I went to my room to change my work boots. As I passed the cherrywood dresser, I opened the first drawer. Beneath the fine wool shawl, the carved box Arthur had given me was still in its place. I opened it. The small black USB device rested peacefully beside the pocket watch, stopped at 3:15. It was no longer a loaded weapon, now it was a shield at rest. I closed the box and pushed the drawer shut until I heard the click of the wood interlocking. I returned to the hallway and walked towards the dining room. I crossed the dark room, passing the large oak table where everything had been decided months ago. I didn't turn on the light. There was no need. I reached the large glass cabinet, the hutch where I kept the dishes. I opened the glass doors. The faint creak of the hinges sounded in the silence of the house. I reached into the upper shelf. There, pushed into the darkest corner, almost against the back wood, were the bottle green porcelain teacups with the gilded rim. I brushed them with my fingertips. They were cold, already covered by a thin layer of dust from inactivity. They were beautiful, fragile, almost translucent, and they would never be used again. They belonged to a past where I tried to buy love by serving coffee on a silver tray. That time had closed. I withdrew my hand from the dark corner. On the shelf below, within direct reach, I took a different mug. It was a thick, heavy ceramic mug, earth brown, with the rim slightly chipped from years of use. It was Arthur's favorite mug, a worker's mug. I went to the kitchen, heated new water, and prepared a herbal tea using the lemon verbena leaves I had dried myself in the summer sun. The citrusy, earthy aroma filled the space. I took the brown mug by its thick handle and walked out to the outdoor porch. Night had already completely fallen over the valley. The sky was a deep black blanket pierced by thousands of bright, cold stars that seemed within reach. The wind whispered through the eucalyptus branches, a constant rustle that sounded like breathing. In the distance, near the corrals, I heard the short bark of one of the dogs, followed by the absolute silence of a guarded, peaceful territory. I sat in the wicker chair, the same chair I'd occupied all my life. I placed the brown mug on the small wrought iron table. There were no silver trays, no deceptive documents, no visitors waiting for me to stumble over my own words. There was only the night, the earth, and me. I looked west, towards the darkness where I knew the old walnut trees stood. I couldn't see them in the gloom, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly where they were. I knew the depth of their roots clinging to the stone and mud. I knew they had survived droughts, storms, and the blade of a chainsaw that never got to start. I raised the thick ceramic mug and took a long sip of the lemon verbena tea. The warmth went down my throat, settling in my chest, melting the last traces of the ice that had protected me for months. The sentinel could rest tonight. The battle was won. I leaned back in the wicker chair, crossed my hands in my lap, and let the silence of my home completely envelop me, knowing that tomorrow, when the sun rose again, the earth would still be exactly under my feet,